Good morning, friends. We're finishing up chapter 12. After perhaps half an hour of visiting among the tables, the foreman reminded us that we had a day's quota to meet, and people drifted back to their places. The foreman's name, I learned, was Mormon, and he had been headmaster of a Roman Catholic boys' school. He himself came over to my workbench the third day I was there. He had heard that I had followed the entire assembly line through the barracks, tracing what became of my dull little piles of rods. "You're the first woman worker," he said, "who has ever shown any interest in what we are making here." "I am very interested," I said. "I'm a watchmaker." He stared at me with new interest. "Then I have work you will enjoy more." He took me to the opposite end of the huge shed where the final assembly of relay switches was done. It was intricate and exacting work, though not nearly so hard as watch repair, and Mr. Mormon was right. I enjoyed it, and it helped make the 11-hour workday go faster. Not only to me, but to all the Phillips workers, Mr. Mormon acted more as a kindly older brother than a crew boss. I would watch him ceaselessly moving among his hundreds of charges, counseling, encouraging, finding a simpler job for the weary, a harder one for the restless. We had been at Butte more than a month before I learned that his 20-year-old son had been shot here at the camp the week Betsy and I arrived. No trace of this personal tragedy showed in his care for the rest of us. He stopped frequently at my bench, the first weeks more to check my frame of mind than my work, but eventually his eyes would travel to the row of relay switches in front of me. "Dear watch lady, can you not remember for whom you are working? These radios are for the fighter planes." And reaching across for me, he would yank a wire from its housing or twist a tiny tube from an assembly. "Now solder them back wrong, and not so fast. You're over the day's quota, and it's not yet noon." Lunchtime would have been the best time of day if I could have spent it with Betsy. However, Phillips workers were not allowed to leave the factory compound until the workday ended at 6. Prisoners on kitchen detail lugged in great buckets of gruel made of wheat and peas, tasteless but nourishing. Apparently there had been a cutback in rations recently, still the food was better and more plentiful than at Schwenningen, where there had been no noonday meal at all. After eating, we were free for a blessed half-hour to stroll about within the Phillips compound in the fresh air and the glorious Brabant sun. Most days I found a spot along the fence and stretched out on the warm ground to sleep. The day started with roll call at 5 a.m. Sweet summer smells came in the breezes from the farms around the camp. Sometimes I would dream that Carol and I were walking hand in hand along a country lane. At 6 in the evening there was another roll call, when we marched back to our various sleeping barracks. Betsy always stood in the doorway of ours, waiting for me. Each evening it was as though a week had passed. There was so much to tell one another. That Belgian boy and girl at the bench next to mine, this noon they became engaged. Mrs. Hirma, whose granddaughter was taken to Germany, today she let me pray with her. One day Betsy's news touched us directly. "A lady from Ermello has transferred to the sewing detail today." When I introduced myself, she said, "Another one." What did she mean? "Corrie, do you remember the day we were arrested? A man came to the shop. You were sick and I had to wake you up." I remembered very well. Remembered the strange roving eyes, the uneasiness in the pit of my stomach that was more than fever. Apparently everyone in Ermello knew him. He worked with the Gestapo from the first day of occupation. He reported this woman's 2 brothers for resistance work, and finally herself and her husband too. When Ermello had finally caught on to him, he had come to Haarlem and teamed up with Willems and Kaptein. His name was Jan Vogel. Flames of fire seemed to leap around that name in my heart. I thought of father's final hours alone and confused in a hospital corridor, of the underground work so abruptly halted. I thought of Mary Italy arrested while walking down a street, and I knew that if Jan Vogel stood in front of me now I could kill him. Betsy drew the little cloth bag from beneath her overalls and held it out to me, but I shook my head. Betsy kept the Bible during the day, since she had more chance to read and teach it from here than I did at the Phillips barracks. In the evenings we held a clandestine prayer meeting for as many as could crowd around our bunk. "You lead the prayers tonight, Betsy. I have a headache." More than a headache. All of me ached with the violence of my feelings about the man who had done us so much harm. That night I did not sleep, and the next day at my bench scarcely heard the conversation around me. By the end of the week I had worked myself into such a sickness of body and spirit that Mr. Mormon stopped at my bench to ask if something were wrong. Wrong? Yes, something's wrong, and I plunged into an account of that day. I was only too eager to tell Mr. Mormon and all Holland how Jan Vogel had betrayed his country. What puzzled me all this time was Betsy. She had suffered everything I had, and yet she seemed to carry no burden of rage. "Betsy," I hissed one dark night, when I knew that my restless tossing must be keeping her awake. 3 of us now shared this single cot, as the crowded camp daily received new arrivals. "Betsy, don't you feel anything about Jan Vogel? Doesn't this bother you?" "Oh, yes, Corrie, terribly. I've felt for him ever since I knew, and pray for him whenever his name comes into my mind. How dreadfully he must be suffering." For a long time I lay silent in the huge shadowy barracks, restless with sighs, snores, and stirrings of hundreds of women. Once again I had a feeling that this sister, with whom I had spent all my life, belonged somehow to another order of beings. Wasn't she telling me in her gentle way that I was as guilty as Jan Vogel? Didn't he and I stand together before an all-seeing God, convicted of the same sin of murder? For I had murdered him with my heart and with my tongue. "Lord Jesus," I whispered into the lumpy ticking of the bed, "I forgive Jan Vogel, as I pray that you will forgive me. I have done him great damage. Bless him now and his family." That night, for the first time since our betrayer had a name, I slept deep and dreamlessly until the whistle summoned us to roll call. The days in Butte were a baffling mixture of good and bad. Morning roll call was often cruelly long. If the smallest rule had been broken, such as a single prisoner late for evening check-in, the entire barracks would be punished by a 4 a.m. or even 3:30 call, and made to stand at parade attention until our backs ached and our legs cramped. But the summer air was warm and alive with birds as the day approached. Gradually in the east, a pink and gold sunrise would light the immense Brabant sky as Betsy and I squeezed each other's hands in awe. At 5:30 we had black bread and coffee, bitter and hot, and then fell into marching columns for the various work details. I looked forward to this hike to the Phillips factory. Part of the way we walked beside a small woods, separated only by a roll of barbed wire from the glistening world of dewdrops. We also marched past a section of the men's camp, many of our group straining to identify a husband or a son among the ranks of shaved heads and striped overalls. This was another of the paradoxes of Butte. I was endlessly, daily, grateful to be again with people. But what I had not realized in solitary confinement was that to have companions meant to have their griefs as well. We all suffered with the women whose men were in this camp. The discipline in the male section was much harsher than in the women's, executions more frequent. Almost every day a salvo of shots would send the anguished whispers flying. How many this time? Who were they? The woman next to me at the relay bench was an intense communist woman named Fleur. She and her husband had managed to get their 2 small children to friends before their arrest, but she worried aloud all day about them and about Mr. Fleur, who had tuberculosis. He worked in the rope-making crew in the compound next to Phillips, and each noon they managed to exchange a few words through the barbed wire separating the 2 enclosures. Although she was expecting a 3rd child in September, she would never eat her morning allotment of bread, but passed it through the fence to him. She was dangerously thin. I felt for an expectant mother, and several times I brought her a portion of my own breakfast bread, but this too she always set aside for Mr. Fleur. And yet, in spite of sorrow and anxiety, and no one in that place was without both, there was laughter too in the Phillips barracks. An impersonation of the pompous, blustering second lieutenant, a game of blind man's bluff, a song passed in rounds from bench to bench until thick clouds, the signal might come from any bench that faced a window. The factory barracks was set in the center of the broad Phillips compound. There was no way a camp official could approach it without crossing this open space. In an instant every bench would be filled, the only sound the business-like rattle of radio parts. One morning the code words were still being relayed down the long shed when a rather hefty Officerin stepped through the door. She glanced furiously about, face flushing scarlet as she applied thick clouds to her appearance. She shrieked and ranted for a quarter of an hour, then deprived us of our noontime break in the open air that day. After this we adopted the more neutral sign, 15. I've assembled 15 dials. During the long, hot afternoons, prank and talk died down as each one sat alone with his own thoughts. I scratched on the side of the table the number of days until September 1. There was nothing official about that date, just a chance remark by Mrs. Fleur to the effect that 6 months was the usual prison term for ration card offenders. Then, if that were the charge, and if they included the time served in Schwenningen, September 1 would be our release date. "Corrie," Betsy warned one evening when I announced triumphantly that August was half over. "We don't know for sure." I had the feeling almost that to Betsy it didn't matter. I looked at her, sitting on our cot in the last moments before lights out, sewing up a split seam in my overalls, as she'd so often sat mending under the lamplight in the dining room. Betsy, by the very way she sat, evoked a high-backed chair behind her and a carpet at her feet, instead of this endless row of metal cots on the bare pine floor. The first week we were there she had added extra hooks to the neck of her overalls so that she could fasten the collar high around her throat, and this propriety taken care of, I had the feeling she was as content to be reading the Bible here in view to those who had never heard it, as she had been serving soup to hungry people in the hallway of the Beijing. As for me, I set my heart every day more firmly on September 1. And then, all of a sudden, it looked as though we would not have to wait even this long. The Princess Irene Brigade was rumored to be in France, moving toward Belgium. The brigade was part of the Dutch forces. The Princess Irene Brigade was rumored to be in France, marching toward Belgium. The brigade was part of the Dutch forces that had escaped to England during the 5-day war. Now it was marching to reclaim its own. The guards were noticeably tense. Roll call was in an agony. The old and ill who were slowly reaching their places were beaten mercilessly. Even the red light commando came in for discipline. These young women were ordinarily a favored group of prisoners, prostitutes, most from Amsterdam. They were in prison not for their profession, which was extolled as a patriotic duty, but for infecting German soldiers. Ordinarily, with the male guards anyway, they had a bold, breezy manner. Now even they had to form ruler straight lines and stand hours at frozen attention. The sound of the firing squad was heard more and more often. One lunchtime, when the bell sounded to return to work, Mrs. Fleur did not appear at the bench beside me. It always took a while for my eyes to readjust to the dim factory after the bright sun outside. It was only gradually that I saw the hunk of black bread still resting at her place on the bench. There had been no husband to deliver it to. And so, hanging between hope and horror, we waited out the days. Rumor was all we lived on. The brigade was across the Dutch border. The brigade was destroyed. The brigade had never landed. Women who had stayed away from the whispered little prayer service around our cot now crowded close, demanding signs and predictions from the Bible. On the morning of September 1, Mrs. Fleur gave birth to a baby girl. The child lived 4 hours. Several days later, we awoke to the sound of distant explosions, long before the roll call whistle. The entire barracks was up and milling about in the dark between the cots. Was it bombs? Artillery fire? Surely the brigade had reached Brabant. This very day they might be in view. The scowls and threats of the guards when they arrived daunted us not at all. Everyone's mind had turned homeward. Everyone talked of what she would do first. "The plants will all be dead," said Betsy, "and we'll get some cuttings from Nolly. We'll wash the windows so the sun can come in." At the Phillips factory, Mr. Mormon tried to calm us. "Those aren't bombs," he said, "and certainly not guns. That's demolition work. Germans. They're probably blowing up bridges. It means they expect an attack, but not that it's here. It might not come for weeks." This dampened us a bit, but as the blast came closer and closer, nothing could keep hope down. Now they were so near they hurt our ears. "Drop your lower jaw," Mr. Mormon called down in the long room. "Keep your mouth open and it will save your eardrums." We had our midday meal inside of the doors and windows closed. We'd been working again for an hour, or sitting at our benches. No one could work. When the order came to return to dormitories, with sudden urgency, women embraced husbands and sweethearts who worked beside them at Phillips. Betsy was waiting for me outside our barracks. "Corrie, has the brigade come? Are we free?" "No, not yet. I don't know. Oh, Betsy, why am I so frightened?" The loudspeaker in the men's camp was sounding the signal for roll call. No order was given here, and we drifted about aimlessly, listening we scarcely knew for what. Names were being read through the men's speaker, though it was too far away to make them out. And suddenly an insane fear gripped the waiting women. A death-like silence now hung over both sides of the vast camp. The loudspeaker had fallen silent. We exchanged wordless looks. We almost feared to breathe. Then rifle fire split the air. Around us women began to weep. A second volley, a third. For 2 hours the executions went on. Someone counted. More than 700 male prisoners were killed that day. There was little sleeping in our barracks that night, and no roll call the following morning. About 6 a.m. we were ordered to collect our personal belongings. Betsy and I put our belongings into the pillowcases we had brought from Schweningen, toothbrushes, needles, and thread, a small bottle of D-vitamin oil that had come in a Red Cross package, Nolly's blue sweater, which was the only thing we had brought with us when we left the quarantine camp 10 weeks before. I transferred the Bible in its bag from Betsy's back to my own. She was so thin it made a visible bump between her shoulders. We were marched to a field where soldiers were passing out blankets from the backs of open trucks. As we piled past, Betsy and I drew 2 beautiful, soft, new ones. Mine was white with blue stripes, Betsy's white with red stripes, obviously the property of some well-to-do family. About noon, the exodus from camp began. Through the drab streets of barracks we went, past the bunkers, through the maze of barbed wire compounds and enclosures, and at last onto the rough dirt road through the woods down which we had stumbled that rainy night in June. Betsy hung hard to my arm. She was laboring for breath, as she always did when she had to walk any distance. March! Schnell! Double time! I slipped my arm beneath Betsy's shoulders and half carried her the final quarter mile. At last the path ended, and we lined up facing the single track, over 1,000 women standing toe to heel. Farther along, the men's section was also at the siding. It was impossible to identify individuals among the shaved heads glistening in the autumn sun. At first, I thought our train had not come. Then I realized that these freight cars standing on the tracks were for us. Already the men were being prodded aboard, clambering up over the high sides. We could not see the engine. Just this row of small, high-wheeled European boxcars stretching out of sight in both directions, machine guns mounted at intervals on the roof. Soldiers were approaching along the track, pausing at each car to haul open the heavy sliding door. In front of us, a gaping black interior appeared. Women began to press forward. Clutching our blankets and pillowcases, we were swept along with the others. Betsy's chest was still heaving oddly after the rapid march. I had to boost her over the side of the train. At first I could make out nothing in the dark car. Then in a corner I saw a tall, uneven shape. It was a stack of bread, dozens of flat, black loaves piled one on top of another. A long trip, then. The small car was getting crowded. We were shoved against the back wall. 30 or 40 people were all that could fit in, and still the soldiers drove women over the side, cursing, jabbing with their guns. Shrieks rose from the center of the car, but still the press increased. It was only when 80 women were packed inside that the door thumped shut and we heard iron bolts driven into place. Women were sobbing, and many fainted, although in the tight-wedged crowd they remained upright. Just when it seemed certain that those in the middle must suffocate or be trampled to death, we worked out a kind of system where, by half sitting, half lying, with our legs wedged around one another like members of a sledding team, we were able to get down on the floor of the car. Do you know what I am thankful for? Betsy's gentle voice startled me in that squirming madhouse. I'm thankful that Father is in heaven today. Father, yes. Oh, Father, how could I have wept for you? The warm sun beat down on the motionless train. The temperature in the packed car rose. The air grew foul. Beside me someone was tugging at a nail in the ancient wood of the wall. At last it came free. With a point she set to work gouging the hole wider. Others around the sides took up the idea, and in a while blessed whiffs of outside air began to circle about us. It was hours before the train gave a sudden lurch and began to move. Almost at once it stopped again, then again crawled forward. The rest of the day and into the night it was the same, stopping, starting, slamming, jerking. Once, when it was my turn at the air hole, I saw in the moonlight train men carrying a length of twisted rail. Tracks ahead must be destroyed. I passed the news. Maybe they would not be able to repair them. Maybe we would still be in Holland when liberation came. Betsy's forehead was hot in my hand. The red light girl between whose legs I was wedged squeezed herself into an even tighter crouch so that Betsy could lie almost flat across my lap. I dozed too from time to time, my head on the shoulder of the friendly girl behind us. Once I dreamed it was storming. I could hear the hailstones on Tante John's front windows. I opened my eyes. It really was hailing. I could hear it rattling against the side of the car. Everyone was awake now and talking. Another storm of hail, and then we heard a burst of machine gun fire from the roof of the train. "It's bullets," someone shouted. "They're attacking the train." Again we heard that sound like tiny stones striking the wall. and again the machine guns answered. Had the brigade reached us at last? The firing died away. For an hour the train sat motionless. Then slowly we crawled forward. At dawn someone called out that we were passing through the border of Emmerich. We had arrived in Germany. Have a good day, friends.